When Ethan Cole showed up at the towering glass headquarters of Astoria Enterprises, all he wanted was to deliver his daughter's forgotten lunchbox. A single dad, a former soldier turned mechanic, he had no business standing among suits and heels polished to perfection. But when the receptionist mistook his rugged frame and protective stance for a private bodyguard, and the icy young CEO, Isabella Hart, coolly played along with the assumption, everything changed. What began as a fleeting misunderstanding spiraled into a dangerous dance of hidden identities, fragile trust, and an undeniable pull neither of them had prepared for. Because sometimes love doesn't arrive as a warm invitation, but as a collision you never saw coming. Ethan Cole never felt smaller than when he walked into places that reeked of wealth, glass walls reflecting power and privilege back at him like a cruel mirror. The headquarters of Astoria Enterprises was no different. Its lobby gleamed like something out of a movie, polished marble floors stretching wider than the street outside his modest garage, chandeliers that rained crystal light on sharp, suited men and women striding with the kind of purpose only people with six-figure salaries could own. Ethan didn't belong there, and he knew it. The oil still under his nails, no matter how many times he scrubbed his hands, told a story of long shifts fixing engines, not striking business deals. But he wasn't here to prove anything to anyone. He was here for Ava. His little girl had left her lunchbox in the back seat of his truck that morning, and the school had called him, worried she'd be skipping her meal again. Ethan wasn't about to let that happen. He'd already failed her in so many ways. Failed her mother before that, too, and he swore to himself every day that he wouldn't let his daughter down again. So here he was, a fish out of water in a sea of sharks, clutching a pink lunchbox decorated with fading unicorn stickers, waiting for the receptionist to acknowledge him. The woman at the desk looked up once, gave him a once-over, and blinked as though confused by his presence. It wasn't unusual. Ethan was used to the stares. At 6'3", built like a man who still carried the weight of his military years in every sinew, he didn't exactly blend in with the silk ties and pencil skirts surrounding him. His broad shoulders strained the seams of the only clean shirt he owned. His jaw still shadowed from the shave he hadn't had time for that morning, and his boots, though polished for Ava's sake, looked almost rebellious against the marble floor. He was about to explain himself, voice ready with the line about his daughter's school calling, when the sharp click of heels cut across the lobby. The sound turned heads. The temperature shifted, almost imperceptibly, but enough that Ethan noticed. Power had entered the room. Isabella Hart didn't just walk, she commanded. Clad in a slate, grey tailored dress that hugged her frame with lethal elegance, her dark hair pinned back in a no-nonsense twist, she carried the weight of Astoria's billion-dollar empire on her shoulders as though it were nothing more than silk. People parted for her without realizing it, conversations dipping to whispers in her wake. At 29, she was already notorious for being as ruthless in the boardroom as she was untouchable in her personal life. Men twice her age stumbled under her gaze. Rivals who underestimated her often learned too late that behind her striking beauty was a mind sharpened like a blade. Isabella's life had no space for mistakes, no patience for weakness. But as her eyes, cool, grey and discerning, landed on Ethan, something flickered in her expression, something almost amused. Your security detail. The receptionist asked her in a hushed tone, nodding at Ethan, who stood clutching the lunchbox like a weapon he didn't know how to use. Isabella didn't hesitate. She could have laughed, could have corrected the woman with a dismissive wave, but instead she smiled slow and calculated, as though she'd just been handed a card she hadn't expected in a game she already dominated. "Yes," she said, her voice smooth as glass. "My security." The word rang in Ethan's ears before he could even process what had just happened. Security. He opened his mouth to protest, to tell them they were wrong. But Isabella's eyes flicked toward him with such piercing intensity that he froze. It was the look of a commander in the field, the kind of gaze that told you to hold the line or die trying. And somehow, for reasons he couldn't quite name, Ethan obeyed. The receptionist's attitude shifted instantly. Her suspicion melted into relief, and she offered Ethan a professional smile, one that now carried respect instead of dismissal. Ethan felt the ground tilt beneath him. He had walked in here a father carrying his daughter's lunchbox, a man out of place in a palace of wealth, and in the span of a breath, he had been transformed into something else entirely, her protector. He didn't understand why she had done it, didn't know what game this woman was playing. But for the first time in years, he felt eyes on him that weren't measuring his failures, but assuming his strength. It was terrifying. It was intoxicating. It was the beginning of something he didn't yet have the language for. Ethan adjusted his stance, the old habits of his military training snapping back, without permission, shoulders squared, chin lifted. If this was a role she wanted him to play, he'd play it, for now. Because behind the cool mask of a CEO and the pretense of a security detail, something electric had sparked between them, a thread stretched taut in the silence. And neither of them had the faintest idea just how much that single misunderstanding would alter both of their lives forever. The pretense should have ended in that lobby. Ethan told himself it was none of his business, that he'd slip away once Isabella realized her game was over, drop Ava's lunchbox at the school, and return to the comfort of grease-stained overalls and the hum of car engines. But life, as it so often does, had other plans. One moment he was ready to protest, the next, he was following Isabella into the golden, lit elevator as though her command had tethered him. She didn't speak at first, her eyes fixed on the digital numbers climbing steadily toward the top floor. Ethan caught her reflection in the mirrored wall, composed, calculating, and impossibly unreadable. He wanted to demand an explanation, to ask her why in hell she'd dragged him into whatever charade this was, but his instincts told him to wait. In war zones, patience often saved lives, and though this wasn't a battlefield, the weight in her silence felt just as dangerous. When the doors slid open, the world shifted again. Isabella's office wasn't an office at all. It was a throne room carved out of glass and steel, suspended high above the city. The skyline stretched endlessly, skyscrapers bowing to her vantage point. Ethan felt the same way the moment she turned to face him. "Play along," she said, her voice low, smooth, but edged with steel. "I don't need anyone sniffing around about whether or not I'm vulnerable." Ethan frowned, adjusting the lunchbox in his grip. "Lady, I'm not your damn bodyguard," he said. "I'm a mechanic. My kid left her lunch, that's all." Her gaze sharpened. "Today, you're what I say you are." It wasn't arrogance. It was survival. Something in her tone told him that this wasn't just a game of appearances. It was a wall she'd built around herself, a fortress of control. And against his better judgment, Ethan didn't walk out. Maybe it was the soldier still buried inside him, wired to respond to authority. Maybe it was the way she carried herself like someone who had never allowed herself to collapse. And yet he saw the tiniest crack in her eyes, as if collapse was always one wrong move away. Whatever it was, he stayed. Days turned into weeks, and what began as a one-off misunderstanding grew into something neither of them could untangle. Isabella allowed the lie to persist. Ethan Cole, her new security hire. At first, Ethan thought he'd be exposed within a day. Surely someone would ask for paperwork, credentials, a resume he didn't have. But Isabella smoothed over every detail with the kind of precision only she possessed. She spoke for him in meetings, introduced him with the cool authority of someone who expected no one to question her decisions, and soon enough no one did. Ethan adapted, because survival was all he'd ever known. He stood by her side during tense negotiations, shadowed her at charity galas, where whispers followed them like perfume, and drove her home in sleek black cars that smelled of leather and money. And all the while, Ava's unicorn lunchbox sat in his truck like a reminder of who he really was and what he was doing this for. He told himself he was only staying until Isabella decided she didn't need the cover anymore. But the longer he remained, the harder it became to draw the line between what was real and what was performance. Ethan wasn't blind. He saw the way Isabella's mask slipped when she thought no one was watching. In the stillness of late nights at the office, when the city glittered beyond the glass, she let exhaustion crease her face, let her shoulders slump ever so slightly under the weight of a billion-dollar empire she had inherited far too young. She wasn't just ruthless, she was alone. And for reasons he didn't want to name, Ethan found himself softening. He started carrying her coffee without being asked, staying late to ensure she ate something besides work, stepping in when vultures in tailored suits circled too close. What startled him most wasn't the responsibility. It was how natural it felt to protect her. Not because she was the CEO, not because she demanded it, but because she was human, fragile in ways she'd never admit. And Isabella noticed. She noticed the steadiness in his presence, the way he never flinched under her sharpest commands, the quiet gentleness that surfaced when he spoke about Ava. He wasn't like anyone in her world of polished deceit and endless ambition. He was solid, real, and that terrified her more than anything. The turning point came one evening when a bored rival, emboldened by too much whiskey, cornered Isabella at a gala. His words were sugar-coated, but his intent was sharp, questioning her ability to hold power without crumbling, hinting at scandals that could break her. Ethan saw her spine stiffen, her chin lift, but he also saw the flicker of vulnerability in her eyes, the kind of vulnerability predators fed on. Without thinking, Ethan stepped forward, his voice calm but laced with warning. "That's close enough." The man sneered, but one look at Ethan's frame and the soldier's authority in his stance sent him retreating with a muttered excuse. Isabella didn't thank him, not with words. Instead, later that night, as he drove her home in silence, she said softly, "You didn't have to do that." He glanced at her, the city lights painting her profile in gold. "Yeah," he said, "I did." Something unspoken settled between them in that moment, something more binding than the lie that had started it all. But feelings were dangerous, and Isabella knew better than to indulge in them. She tried to push him away, tightening her walls, reminding herself that Ethan was temporary, an accident born of convenience. Yet every time she tried to distance herself, something pulled her back. The way Ava's laughter lit Ethan's eyes when he talked about her. The way his silence wasn't empty, but steady, grounding her when her world spun out of control. And Ethan, for his part, battled his own storm. He couldn't afford distractions. Not when every day was about proving to his daughter that she was safe, that he wouldn't abandon her like the world had abandoned him. Yet Isabella crept into his thoughts, her face slipping between Ava's drawings on the fridge and the long nights he spent under the hood of a car. She didn't belong in his world, and he didn't belong in hers. And still, they found themselves orbiting each other, closer and closer, until distance became impossible. It wasn't a grand confession that broke the dam, but a quiet night, long after the office had emptied. Isabella had stayed behind, exhaustion pulling at her features, and Ethan lingered, leaning against the glass wall, watching her work. Finally, she dropped her pen, pressing her fingers to her temples. "Do you ever get tired of holding it all together?" she whispered, more to herself than to him. The vulnerability in her voice cracked something open in Ethan. He crossed the room, slow and deliberate, until he was close enough to see the faint tremble in her hands. "Every damn day," he admitted. Her eyes lifted to his, and for the first time she let him see the storm behind her carefully built walls. And in that fragile space, the truth finally bloomed, not in words, but in the way her breath caught when he brushed a stray strand of hair from her face, in the way she leaned into his touch as though she'd been waiting her whole life for someone to steady her without asking for anything in return. From that night on, the line between pretense and reality blurred until it vanished. They didn't call it love, not yet. But it was there, in the way Isabella let him drive her home, even when she could have summoned anyone else, in the way Ethan started keeping a spare tie in his truck, just in case she needed him to blend in the way Ava, with all the unfiltered wisdom of a child, looked at Isabella one afternoon and asked, "Are you going to be my new mom?" The question startled them both, laughter and silence colliding, but it planted a seed neither could ignore. For all their differences, for all the worlds that separated them, something undeniable had rooted itself between them. And though they both feared what it meant, they also knew they couldn't turn away. The lie that began it all, Ethan the bodyguard, had long since become irrelevant. What mattered was the truth that had grown in its place: two broken people, one hardened by power, the other scarred by survival, finding in each other the strength to finally breathe. And as Isabella stood one morning at her office window, watching Ethan laugh with Ava in the lobby below, she realized that for the first time in years she wasn't afraid, Not of failure, not of vulnerability, not of love. Because sometimes the heart doesn't care about logic or class or the lies that started it all. Sometimes the heart only knows when it's finally home.